So I wanted to ask you, Dr. Khalidi, because you obviously are an expert in Palestine, in Middle East history, but you also write a lot about imperialism
Mhm.
and colonialism. And a lot of people have pointed out that what the protesters here in the United States are experiencing is not comparable, of course, to what people are experiencing in Rafah right now as we speak. And just to remind people, in case anyone missed it, Israeli forces are continuing to attack Rafah as we speak. Sunday, it bombed a tent camp for displaced Palestinians, killing 45 people, including children. The Israeli prime minister obviously lied and said that the bombing was a tragic mistake. But what is the connection between the genocide happening that the United States is supporting and the crackdown here at home? And some people have spoken about how imperialism or colonialism turned inward is fascism. What is the connection between those two things?
I mean, it's a vast question, Katie. It's a really good question. I think the short answer is that this is not just an Israeli war on Gaza. This is an American war. It could not happen. It would be literally impossible, as it actually has been the case for most of what's happened in Palestine since 1917, without the greatest imperial power of the age being a direct participant in this war. It wasn't Zionist militias that destroyed the Palestinian national movement in the 1930s. It was the British Army, the Royal Air Force, 100,000 troops. They crushed the Palestinians on behalf of the Zionist project. And it's not Israeli bombs or planes or artillery shells that are being used today. It's not an Israeli veto in the UN Security Council that for 7.5 months has permitted this slaughter to continue. The United States is a direct participant. And that's one of the core arguments I make in the 100 Years' War book. And I think if you don't understand that, you don't understand anything. There is a conflict between Zionism and between Israel and the Palestinians. That's part of it. This is partly a national conflict, and it has settler colonial aspects to it. But you can't have settler colonialism without a metropole. And we, the United States and Western Europe to a lesser extent, are the metropole. Without that metropole, this project could not have worked, certainly not as it worked. Was there Zionism before Herzl tried to win over the Kaiser? Of course there was. Was there Zionism before Weizmann won over the British in 1917? Of course there was. Would it have succeeded the way it has? No. Would it have won all of these wars without that massive external support? No. Would this war be possible without the United States as a participant, not as a backer, as a participant effectively? No. None of this is possible. So that's the link in the broadest possible sense. I could go into more detail about how when you make a certain kind of war abroad, ultimately it comes home.
Would
The
love
area
that.
of surveillance starts in places like Libya and Iraq and what was then the northwest provinces of India, right after World War I and right before World War I. It then ends up in firebombing of Dresden, the Blitz on London, the bombing of Hiroshima, the firebombing of Tokyo. Colonial violence, breeds methods of counterinsurgency that have a tendency to come home. The British developed means of counterinsurgency, which they teach the Israelis, by the way, in the 1930s, what becomes the nucleus of the Israeli army. And it ends up in Belfast in 1970, in 1971, and 1972. So you make a certain kind of war abroad, and some of those things come home. And unfortunately, we've seen this in now 3 wars. We saw it, I think, in the Vietnam War. We saw it in the Iraq War. And we're seeing it with this war. As public opinion shifts against these wars, and the elite is still committed to continuing on this course of war and genocide, they are obliged to use these obnoxious police state methods. The students are just the tip of an iceberg. If you look at all the polls, if you look at where the unions are, if you look at where black pastors are, American public opinion has shifted against this war long ago, months ago. Has the Biden administration shifted? Has Congress shifted? Have the media, most of the mainstream media shifted? Have the owners of companies that are refusing to hire young Palestinians or young supporters of the Palestine cause? No, they haven't shifted. The elite has not shifted. And so they're obliged to use more and more obnoxious police state methods to stay on the course that they've decided on.
So Brad actually writes, I think part of the crackdown is because the U.S. empire can't allow the precedent of civilians believing that activism can actually dictate behavior to the U.S. war machine. Want to know your thoughts on that.
I mean, this is not the first case of this. Look back at Vietnam. Those of us who in our youth were opposed to this war, eventually came to represent a majority. It took years before that war was ended. Neither Johnson nor Nixon ended it quickly or easily. The same thing was true with the Iraq War. Public opinion, if you look at public opinion over Iraq, after 9/11, it strongly supported President Bush in going after Afghanistan and then later in going after Iraq. Within a very short period, public opinion had shifted. People realized this is not a good idea. Everything they're telling us is a complete lie. This man had nothing to do with 9/11, Saddam Hussein. This regime, obnoxious though it was, is not responsible for terrorism that attacked the United States. People understood the lying basis on which that war was conducted. And it continued for years. I mean, there's still American troops in Iraq. There's still American troops in Syria as part of the same mission. I think he's right. I think that they'll fight tooth and nail to maintain their wars abroad for the strategic, for whatever reasons, economic, for ego reasons. Even after public opinion has finally realized that they're lying liars who are lying about everything. That what this administration is saying about what Israel does is lies, a tissue of lies. They're reading off the playbook of the Israeli military spokesman. I look at Admiral Kirby and I say, Admiral Hagari, the Israeli military spokesman, it has a perfect American accent. They're
Yeah.
both admirals, as it happens. How you get to be a real admiral when all you are is a flak is beyond me. But that's another question.
Ireland is recognizing Palestinian statehood. Brad, can we show that tweet from Eylon Levy, who is literally a fired Hasbarist who keeps doing Hasbar and PR for Israel? He actually tweeted out an image of a protest uh, with a bunch of Irish flags at Hyde Park, and he quote tweeted that and said, "Notice how Palestinian flags are always paired with Irish flags while Israeli flags are paired with UK flags." And he actually thought that that was a pro-Israel statement.
Well, I think it's perfectly appropriate for Israeli flags to be paired with UK flags,
Right, of
and
course.
it's perfectly appropriate for Palestinian flags to be paired with Irish flags. Whatever the gentleman who tweeted that may think.
It's a bit of a self-own, I believe is what they call it. And there's such an interesting relationship between Ireland and Palestine. Could you talk about that relationship?
Yeah, it's a topic which, whenever this infernal war ends, I'm hoping to devote some time and energy to.
Oh, nice.
It's a subject that's fascinated me for many years, ever since I was in Ireland and began talking about the project for my last book back in 2018, 19, whenever it was. And every time I would say something, my Irish interlocutors would say, "Oh, yes, that happened to us," and talk
Right,
about the same people I was talking about: Lloyd George, Churchill,
right,
Balfour, this general, that counterinsurgency specialist. And the same people who were doing what they were doing to Palestine in the beginning of the 20th century were doing the same kinds of things to the Irish during their War of Independence. And that even continues into the Troubles in the 60s and 70s. The Ireland is interesting. If you see these things in terms of what I would argue is the correct framework, which is a settler colonial framework. Ireland is the first overseas European settler colony. England starts with the Irish in the 12th century. And they really don't let up until today, if you consider Northern Ireland under British control to be some form of a continuation of that English presence in Ireland. So 850 years. And there are so many ways in which there are similarities. Obviously, there are differences. Zionism is completely different than the planters, so-called, the Protestant planters, so-called, whom the English settled in Ulster and other parts of Ireland. It's a national movement. It's a response to persecution in Christian persecution in Europe. It has all kinds of character. The biblical connection to the land of Israel make it completely different than any other settler colonial project. But in its lineaments, in its fundamentals, in many aspects of how it has operated, it's quite similar to other settler colonial projects. And the paradigmatic settler colonial project is Ireland. And the Irish recognize this. They see the parallel. They see the parallels even before Palestinians do, and they feel that what has been done to them is similar to what is being done to the Palestinians over a much longer period of time and in
right.
many different ways.
And then you have the hunger striking also
Right, right. Well,
parallel.
There's all kinds of ways.
Yeah.
The way in which the Irish are described as terrorists by the British during the Troubles. One
Right.
man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. It's a fraught topic in Ireland to this day. The civilian casualties inflicted by the provisional IRA, the civilian casualties inflicted by the Protestant militias and by the British military and police in Northern Ireland, atrocities in England committed by the IRA, by the provisional IRA during the Troubles. These are subjects that are deeply contentious and painful to this day in Northern Ireland and the Republic and in the United Kingdom. So there's all kinds of parallels. Of course, what the British state did was not terrorism. When the British would assassinate somebody or would support a militia that assassinates somebody, that wasn't terrorism.
Security.
It was terrorism. When the British shot down unarmed demonstrators, that was not terrorism. The states are never terrorists.
Right.
The state violence is it's a different level than the violence of non-state actors. And that's one of the reasons I think this term is so problematic. I don't know if killing people with 2,000-pound bombs is somehow morally superior to killing them with a Qassam rocket or with a whatever it may be. I don't quite understand how that moral calculus works, such that this is terrorism and this is sanctionable state violence.
Right.
I think that's one reason that people like the African National Congress or the Front de Libération Nationale, the FLN in Algeria, were typed by their opponents as terrorists. And today you look at this as regrettable, perhaps, but understandable violence by a colonized people against their colonizer. I think one day people will see Palestine in the same way for all of the problematic issues, morally and legally, that violence against civilians involves.